So I want you to imagine for a moment that you have just inherited this massive, sprawling, centuries-old house.
Right, like a real historical estate.
Exactly. It is this magnificent piece of architecture, but maybe it's a little drafty in the winter, and the floorboards creak in a way that just keeps you up at night. So you gather all the people currently living in the house in the main living room, and you propose a solution.
Okay.
You take a vote. You say, should we knock down the main load-bearing wall to make like an open concept kitchen and let some more light in? And you look around the room. Every single person raises their hand. It is completely unanimous. The people have spoken.
So you grab a sledgehammer.
Right. You grab a sledgehammer. But just as you pull it back to swing, someone taps you on the shoulder and asks a very strange question. They say, did you consult the architect who laid the foundation for that wall? Did you consult the people who will be living in this house 100 years from now?
Which sounds completely absurd in the moment.
Yeah, you look at them like they have completely lost their minds. You point to the people in the room and say, look, the architect is dead. The future residents aren't here yet. We are the ones living here right now. We just took a vote.
But the person blocking your sledgehammer replies, you might be the one standing in the living room today, but you do not own this house. You're just renting it from the past, and, well, you're holding it in trust for the future.
And man, that realization strikes at the core of a deeply uncomfortable political truth. Because we naturally assume that if a group of people are affected by a structure and they all agree to change it, that should just be the absolute end of the story.
Yeah, it aligns perfectly with our modern, intuitive sense of democratic fairness. You take a vote, the majority rules, and you knock down the wall.
But stepping out of that living room and into the really rigorous world of constitutional law and political philosophy, that simple majority vote suddenly looks incredibly fragile. The entire concept of majority rules just sort of fractures. So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are embarking on a massive scholarly mission to untangle one of the most profound political puzzles of our time.
It really is.
We're exploring a 2023 book by political philosopher Alessandro Ferrara. It's titled Sovereignty Across Generations: Constituent Power and Political Liberalism. And the massive question we're trying to answer today for you is exactly what we just described with that drafty inherited house.
Right. Who actually holds the power to change a country's constitution?
Exactly. Is it the people living right now who are currently breathing and paying taxes and voting? Or is it a cross-generational partnership that includes the dead and the unborn? Okay, let's unpack this.
So the lens we are using to untangle this tension between popular sovereignty, the will of the masses and constitutional rights, draws really heavily from the philosopher John Rawls. Specifically, we're looking at his 1993 work, Political Liberalism.
A huge foundational text.
Absolutely. And we are going to examine impartially how these philosophical frameworks explain modern political movements. We'll be applying this lens across the entire political spectrum to understand the actual mechanics of how democracies evolve, or in some cases, how they collapse.
And to set the stage for everything that follows, we really need to introduce the biggest paradigm shift of this entire book. It is the core realization that is going to redefine how you watch the news, how you view elections, and honestly, how you think about your own rights.
It's a big one.
It is. It's the idea that the voters and the people are not the same thing.
Which is wild, because we conflate them constantly in our daily lives, right? Politicians certainly conflate them to claim mandates all the time. But philosophically and legally, the electorate, the people casting ballots on a given Tuesday, and the people, the sovereign entity that actually justifies a nation's existence, are vastly different entities.
So different.
And understanding the mechanics of that difference requires us to start with the fundamental problem that John Rawls was trying to solve back in the late 20th century.
Right, and the central crisis Rawls was obsessed with wasn't just how to build a democracy from scratch, it was how a society survives the test of time. He asked a question that feels, more urgent today than ever. How can a society of free, equal citizens who are deeply, fundamentally divided by religion, morals, and philosophy remain stable over time?
That phrase is everything.
Over time. Yes, that phrase is the hidden key to this entire deep dive. Because, look, it is relatively easy for an authoritarian to just force stability for a decade through sheer coercion, right? But maintaining a stable, fair society across generations, when your citizens fundamentally disagree about the very nature of the universe, that requires an entirely different architecture.
And Ferrara points out that Rawls offered 3 structural breakthroughs to solve this exact problem of time and pluralism. The first one is what he calls normative democratic dualism.
Normative democratic dualism. Okay, break that down for us.
It's basically the strict separation of everyday politics from higher constitutional lawmaking. Everyday politics is the friction of daily life. It's debating tax rates, highway funding, or healthcare
The
regulation.
stuff in the news every night.
Exactly.
Hmm?
But higher lawmaking is about the fundamental rights of citizens and the structural rules of the government itself.
And if we blend those two things together, the whole system just implodes. Because if changing the bedrock principles of a society's constitution is as easy as, say, changing the speed limit on a highway, then the Constitution essentially has no protective power. A temporary majority could just vote away the rights of a minority on a total whim.
Which leads directly to the second breakthrough, legitimation by constitution. This establishes the Constitution as the ultimate benchmark. Everyday laws, the speed limits, and the tax codes are only legitimate if they align with the Constitution that all citizens can reasonably endorse.
Right.
So a law passed by the legislature isn't valid simply because a majority voted for it. It's valid because it survives the friction of being tested against that higher constitutional framework.
But, I mean, that brings up an enormous philosophical hurdle. If the Constitution is the ultimate benchmark, whose values are we building that benchmark out of? Because, like you said, we don't all share the same religion or the same moral code.
Yeah, and this is where Rawls introduces his third breakthrough, which Ferrara really highlights as the revolution of the most reasonable.
The most reasonable.
Right. Rawls realized that in a hyper-pluralistic society, a society composed of diverse cultures, secular humanists, dozens of different religious denominations, we simply cannot base our government on one absolute foundational truth with a capital T.
Because if a society bases its constitution on a specific religious doctrine, or even a specific secular philosophy, it inherently oppresses anyone who doesn't share that comprehensive doctrine.
Exactly. Instead, we have to abandon the search for absolute political truth and look for what is the most reasonable political setup for our specific diverse society.
And the source material illustrates this with this brilliant twist on Plato's famous allegory of the cave. To really grasp the mechanics of this, I want you to picture the original Platonic concept. People are chained in a dark cave, they're facing a wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them. They think the shadows are reality.
Right, the classic Philosophy 101 example.
Yeah. And then one philosopher breaks their chains, climbs out of the cave, and sees the true reality, the sun, the trees, the physical world. In Plato's version, that philosopher comes back down to the cave to rule, bringing the absolute truth to the ignorant masses.
But Ferrara asks us to update this for our modern pluralistic reality. Imagine that instead of one philosopher escaping, multiple philosophers break their chains and climb out of the cave. But when they emerge into completely different landscapes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. One philosopher sees a vast, infinite ocean. Another emerges into a dense, ancient forest. A third finds themselves in a bustling, technologically advanced city. They all experience a profound, ultimate reality. But when they return to the cave to govern the people still living in the dark, they bring back completely incompatible, absolute truths.
So if the philosopher who saw the ocean takes power, they might demand that everyone in the cave structure their lives around the tides, worship the water, prepare for a flood. But the philosopher who saw the forest violently disagrees, insisting that reality is rooted in soil and growth. If they try to govern based on their absolute visions of the outside world, they will inevitably end up violently oppressing everyone who doesn't agree with their specific revelation.
And the structural mechanism to prevent this violence is what Rawls calls public reason. The philosophers must realize that they cannot use the coercive power of law to enforce their disputed visions of the outside world. To govern legitimately, they have to identify overlapping, most reasonable principles that they can all agree on, strictly for the purpose of managing the cave.
So they might say, look, we profoundly disagree on what exists outside this cave, but can we agree that while we are down here together, we shouldn't murder each other, we should distribute food equitably, and everyone should have a voice?
Exactly. They're essentially building a shared political language that doesn't rely on anyone's deeply held personal cosmology. That shared language is the Constitution. It's a political conception of justice that is independent of any one group's moral doctrine. That is how you achieve stability over time without resorting to tyranny.
Okay, But a critical vulnerability remains in this architecture, right? Rawls designed a system for long-term stability based on overlapping consensus. The vulnerability is what happens when a political movement emerges inside the cave, rallies a temporary majority of the people currently living there, and declares that the delicate consensus is a betrayal.
Yeah.
What happens when a movement claims that only the current majority's immediate demands actually matter, and that any constitutional rules preventing them from getting their way are just illegitimate?
Well, that brings us face to face with the phenomenon of populism. And it is vital to clarify the rules of engagement here for our listeners. In this deep dive, we are dissecting populism strictly through Ferrara's academic structural framework. We are looking at the machinery under the hood, applying this impartially to both left-wing and right-wing movements.
So whether the historical example is Brexit, the administration of Donald Trump, the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, or the left-wing populist movements in Latin America and Europe, the underlying structural mechanism operating against the constitutional order is identical.
Precisely. We are not evaluating the specific policies of these movements, right? We are evaluating how they interact with the concept of time and sovereignty. And Ferrara offers a highly specific three-pronged definition of populism that strips away the rhetoric and focuses purely on the structural mechanics.
Okay, let's break down those three prongs. What's the first one?
The first prong is conflation. Populism purposefully confuses the people. The transgenerational sovereign that spans the dead, the living, and the unborn with the electorate, the specific group of citizens voting in today's election.
It's the assumption that the people standing in the living room holding the sledgehammers are the absolute owners of the house.
That's exactly it. And this leads to the second prong, unlimited power. Because populism conflates the electorate with the transgenerational people, it assumes the current electorate possesses full constituent power.
And constituent power is the ultimate authority to completely rewrite the rules of the game.
Right. Populism argues that a victory at the ballot box today grants the mandate to just tear up the higher constitutional lawmaking we discussed earlier and start over based on the current mood.
Which inevitably triggers the third prong, right? Justified intolerance. Because if a populist leader claims that their specific electoral victory perfectly embodies the absolute will of the people, then any opposition to their agenda ceases to be a normal democratic disagreement.
Exactly. The opposition isn't just a group of citizens with a different perspective on tax policy anymore. They are structurally categorized as an attack on the general interest. If the leader is the sole voice of the people, then disagreeing with the leader essentially makes you an enemy of the people.
And this framing systematically dismantles the concept of a legitimate political opposition, which is a requirement for any functioning democracy. But, and this is where it gets tricky, the defense of this populist approach often relies on a very appealing, intuitive argument.
It does.
Because wait, if I am standing in a voting booth today, casting a ballot, the intuitive assumption is that my vote, combined with the majority, is the ultimate authority. Isn't democracy supposed to be about the voters getting what they want? If the majority of the electorate wants to drastically change the structure of the government, why shouldn't they be allowed to? I mean, why is it a problem if the electorate thinks they are the people?
This raises an important question. And it introduces a concept that has historically destabilized republics from the inside out. Serial sovereignty. This is a concept championed by historical figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès during the French Revolution.
Serial sovereignty.
Yeah. Serial sovereignty is the belief that each new generation, and by extension, each new electoral majority, gets to completely rewrite the state. It views the Constitution as a piece of property owned exclusively and temporarily by whoever happens to be alive and holding power right now.
But if sovereignty is serial, it means there is no overarching rule of law that protects minorities from the tyranny of the current majority. It destroys the foundational premise of a constitution as a transgenerational pact.
Right.
Because if the voters today are absolute unconstrained sovereigns, they could hold a legally binding vote tomorrow to eliminate free speech or strip citizenship from a specific ethnic group, and under the strict logic of serial sovereignty, it would be entirely legitimate.
Because if the current generation's will is the only benchmark for legitimacy, then there is no higher principle to appeal to when that will becomes oppressive. To escape the trap of serial sovereignty, we have to deeply understand how the power to make and change constituent power actually functions. And Ferrara forces us to navigate one of the most stubborn, ossified philosophical debates of the 20th century to find the answer.
Okay, because if populist movements claim they have the raw, absolute power to rewrite the rules, it forces us to ask a terrifying question. What actually is the power to make a constitution? Where does it even come from? Historically, political philosophy was trapped in this bitter binary between two massive legal thinkers, Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, and to understand the stakes, we have to look at the mechanics of how these two thinkers viewed the creation of law. Let's start with Hans Kelsen. Kelsen was the ultimate formalist. He developed what he called the pure theory of law.
Pure theory.
Right. For Kelsen, the law itself constitutes the people. He completely rejected the idea that there is some mystical, pre-existing, culturally unified group called the people hovering in the ether, waiting to sit down and write a constitution.
So if Kelsen is observing a country drafting a new constitution, he isn't looking at the culture, the history, or the shared struggles of the citizens. He is essentially looking at a mathematical equation.
That mathematical detachment is the defining feature of his theory. Kelsen argued that everything in a legal system relies on a hypothetical basic norm, the Grund norm. You follow a municipal law because the state legislature authorized it. You follow the legislature because the Constitution authorizes it. And you follow the Constitution because you assume a hypothetical foundational basic norm that validates the entire system.
Right.
The system is entirely self-contained. It's closed off from sociology, history, and morality. The people only exist as a legal concept created by the law itself.
But the problem with Kelsen's pure theory is that it feels completely divorced from the messy, violent, passionate reality of history. You can't look at the American Revolution or the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of apartheid in South Africa and say, yes, they simply deduced a new hypothetical basic norm.
No, of course not.
People bleed and die for constitutions. They don't just calculate them.
All right.
Which brings us to the terrifying opposite end of the spectrum, Carl Schmitt.
Yes. If Kelsen viewed the creation of the state as a mathematical equation, Carl Schmitt viewed it as an act of existential warfare. Schmitt, writing during the turbulent collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany, was the ultimate existentialist. He believed that the state is the political decision of a sovereign.
Okay.
For Schmitt, constituent power is raw, unbound, and fiercely existential. It is not derived from a hypothetical norm. It is derived from a sovereign drawing a hard line in the sand and deciding who is a friend and who is an enemy.
So Schmitt argues that before you can have any laws, before you can have a constitution, someone with absolute power has to step up and forge an identity through exclusion. The warlord kicks over the chessboard, declares who belongs and who doesn't, and that raw assertion of power is what creates the state. Whoever makes that decision is completely unbound by any pre-existing law. Law comes after the raw exercise of power.
Exactly. And this creates a deeply bleak binary for anyone trying to understand democracy. You're either trapped in Kelsen's sterile, bloodless legal formulas, or you are subjected to Schmitt's raw, lawless authoritarian power.
Right.
Because if constituent power is just the ability to violently decide who the enemy is, then the populists are right. Whoever wins the election gets to wield that raw power against their opponents.
But Rawls cuts through this binary entirely. Rawls introduces a mechanism that reveals constituent power. The power to make a constitution isn't just a mathematical legal fiction, but it isn't a lawless existential battleground either.
Yeah. Rawls, building on the work of legal scholar Frank Mickelman, argues that constituent power is always under law. And this is a phrase we really have to unpack carefully. When Mickelman and Rawls say that the founders of a nation are operating under law, even before the Constitution is written, they do not mean natural law or a divine command handed down from the heavens.
Right, because we are still operating in the post-Plato's cave world. We do not have access to an absolute universal truth. We are dealing with multiple philosophers who saw different things outside the cave.
Exactly. The law that constrains constituent power is the normativity of the most reasonable. Even in the chaotic moments of overthrowing an old regime and drafting a new constitution, the founders are constrained by what makes sense for their specific historical, cultural, and sociological identity.
They are bound by the need to create a framework that free and equal citizens could reasonably endorse over time.
Yes, they are not acting on raw, unbound power like Schmitt suggested. They're acting on a commitment to reasonableness.
They are looking at the intricate cultural fabric of the people they are representing, their specific history, their unique divisions, their shared traumas, and asking, what is the most reasonable set of rules for us right now that will actually survive into the future? But identifying this introduces a classic philosophical paradox that Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously struggled with.
This is known as Rousseau's riddle. It is essentially the ultimate chicken and egg problem of political science. Rousseau asked, How can a people constitute itself by adopting a constitution if, in order to adopt the constitution, the people must already exist as a unified entity?
Wait, yeah. If the Constitution is the thing that brings the people together and gives them a unified political identity, how do they have the unified identity required to sit down and write the Constitution in the first place? How do you get millions of divided people to agree to a foundational document if they aren't already a cohesive political group?
Ferrara resolves this riddle by utilizing a crucial sociological distinction between two Greek concepts, ethnos and demos. Understanding the mechanics of how one transforms into the other solves the paradox.
Oh, okay, let's define them.
An ethnos is a group of people bound together by non-political traits.
Like, think about the region where you grew up. The people there might share a specific dialect. They might share regional culinary traditions. They might share a history of migrating to that area or a shared religion. They have a distinct cultural identity in ethnos, but they do not necessarily have an autonomous political structure governing them as a unified, independent whole.
A demos, on the other hand, is a politically autonomous group that governs itself. It has political agency and institutional structure. So the mechanism of transformation, the answer to Rousseau's riddle, is how an ethnos becomes a demos.
According to Ferrara's framework, this transformation happens when the ethnos makes a commitment to share commitments. The cultural group looks around and realizes that their shared language and traditions just aren't enough to manage their society. They say, we share a culture, but now we are going to agree to legally bind ourselves together. We are going to establish formal rules for how we will resolve disputes, distribute resources, and protect rights. That formal agreement, that documented consensus, is the shared commitment. The Constitution makes the people, and the people make the Constitution. It is a simultaneous birth.
The demos is born in that exact moment of shared commitment. And once that demos exists, it can exercise its constituent power in several different ways throughout history. Ferrara outlines 4 primary manifestations of this power. The first is regime change, where an existing demos completely overthrows its fundamental structure.
Like the French Revolution transitioning the nation from an absolute monarchy to a republic.
Exactly. A second is secession, where a segment of an ethnos breaks away from a larger entity to form a completely new autonomous demos. We see this in the creation of new nations following the collapse of empires. The third is merging, where an independent demos voluntarily surrenders its individual sovereignty to become part of a larger political project, like independent colonies merging to form a federal union.
But the fourth manifestation is the critical one for our deep dive because it is the primary way constituent power is exercised in modern established democracies today. That is the power of constitution amending.
Yes.
This is the mechanism by which an existing demos transforms itself from within, adapting to new historical realities without overthrowing the entire regime. And understanding the mechanics of amending power brings us right back to the fatal flaw of serial sovereignty.
Because if you hand the current generation of voters the unlimited power to endlessly tinker with the Constitution, treating it like a shared document where anyone with temporary editing access can just delete entire paragraphs, you invite disaster.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To demonstrate exactly why serial sovereignty destroys a nation from the inside out, Ferrara constructs 3 deeply unsettling thought experiments.
These thought experiments isolate the specific structural failures that occur when the current electorate believes they own the state. The first scenario is what Ferrara calls the wanton republic.
The wanton republic. Okay, imagine a country where Generation 1 writes a constitution and establishes a strong executive branch with a powerful presidency. 30 years pass. Generation 2 assumes power, experiences a crisis, decides they absolutely despise the current president, and because they believe they have absolute serial sovereignty, they simply abolish the presidency entirely, replacing it with a parliamentary system.
So wipe it out.
Yeah. Another 30 years pass. Generation 3 takes over, becomes frustrated with the gridlock of the parliament, and abolishes the upper house of the legislature to streamline power. Generation 4 arrives, reinstates the upper house, but uses their temporary majority to establish a mandatory state religion. Generation 5 abolishes the state religion, but fundamentally alters the property rights of the Constitution to implement massive, uncompensated wealth redistribution.
In the wanton republic, the Constitution has been entirely stripped of its transgenerational regulatory function. A constitution is designed to be a stable framework that guides and restrains political behavior over time. But here, the Constitution is nothing more than a volatile mirror, reflecting the fleeting desires, anxieties, and panics of whoever happens to be alive and holding a majority in that specific decade.
Right.
If a constitution completely alters its fundamental structure with every generational shift, it ceases to be a constitution. It is reduced to the status of a temporary statute. It provides zero long-term stability.
It essentially becomes a national mood ring. There is no foundation to build a life upon because you have no idea if the basic structure of your rights will exist in 20 years. That leads to the second thought experiment, which Ferrara calls the indistinct republic.
The indistinct republic forces us to ask a profound question about national identity. If a generation feels absolutely no commitment to the constitutional framework, the struggles, or the legal precedents laid down by their ancestors, then what actually makes them a distinct political entity?
Right. Why is Generation 5 of the Wanton Republic politically distinct from a neighboring country?
Exactly. If they do not share a continuous, unbroken political project with their past, they have no shared political identity.
They might share an ethnos, they might all still eat the same food and speak the same language, but the demos is incredibly hollow. There is no historical thread tying them to a shared political purpose. They are just a random assortment of individuals who happen to occupy the same geographical coordinates at the same time.
It's very fragile.
But the third thought experiment is arguably the most terrifying because it highlights the most predatory aspect of serial sovereignty. Ferrara calls this the underdetermined republic.
This isolates the ethical and structural void at the heart of absolute majority rule. If the current generation of voters possesses absolute, unconstrained power to rewrite the rules, what normative barrier prevents them from intentionally voting to strip the next generation of their rights?
Oh, wow. Imagine a scenario where the current electorate, facing an economic downturn, legally passes an amendment to entirely bankrupt the national treasury, to fund immediate payouts for themselves, passing insurmountable, crushing debt to their children.
Or imagine they use their temporary majority to pass an amendment abolishing environmental protections, intentionally exhausting every natural resource for short-term gain, essentially declaring structural warfare on their own unborn descendants.
If the current voters are absolute sovereigns and their will is the only measure of legitimacy, there is no legal or philosophical mechanism to stop them from disenfranchising the future.
They can legally pull the ladder up behind them. The only antidote to the poison of serial sovereignty is adopting a framework of sequential sovereignty. We must fundamentally restructure our understanding of time and politics. We do not own the Constitution as a piece of present-day property. We are co-authors in a massive, continuous, transgenerational project.
We didn't write the opening chapters, and we won't be here to write the conclusion. But we are entirely responsible for our specific chapter, and we have a binding obligation to ensure our chapter makes logical, structural sense with the chapters that preceded us and the chapters that will follow.
However, adopting the framework of sequential sovereignty introduces a massive, practical, institutional problem.
Of course it does.
If we accept that the people is a transgenerational entity, a partnership that includes the dead who originally drafted the Constitution, the living who inhabit it, and the unborn who will inherit it, who represents the dead and the unborn today.
That's the huge question. If I am an elected politician in the legislature, the structural incentives of my job demand that I only care about the specific living voters who can cast a ballot for me in the next election cycle. The dead cannot donate to my campaign, and the unborn cannot vote for me. The legislature, by its very design, only represents the immediate interests of today's electorate. So who acts as the counterweight?
This brings us to a critical revelation regarding the true function of judicial review. In a political liberal framework, the democratic mandate of a Supreme Court or a constitutional court is wildly misunderstood. Their job is not simply to act as umpires calling balls and strikes for the current voters. Their actual profound democratic function is to represent the transgenerational people.
Wait, really? That reframes the entire purpose of the judiciary? The Supreme Court's primary client isn't the current government, and it isn't the current majority of voters. Their client is the multi-generational demos. They serve as the institutional lawyers for the dead and the unborn.
Exactly. They protect the continuity of the project. And the mechanism they use to execute this mandate is a practice Ferrara calls reflective fidelity, or political originalism. We must draw a very sharp distinction here between this concept and the conservative originalism that frequently dominates modern political discourse.
Right.
Because conservative originalism, in its strictest form, demands that we look exclusively at what the historical founders were thinking in their specific documented moment in time and apply the law exactly as they would have applied it in the 18th century.
Yes.
If they couldn't conceive of a digital surveillance state or the internet, conservative originalism struggles to apply constitutional protections to those specific modern realities because the founders lacked that specific cognitive horizon.
Reflective fidelity, on the other hand, operates on a deeper structural level. The court must stay faithful to the commitments the founders made, but they must apply those commitments to modern contexts, even if the founders themselves fail to fully realize the scope of their own commitments due to the prejudices or limitations of their era. And the most powerful example of this is the commitment to equal protection. When the architects of the American Constitution, or the drafters of the 14th Amendment, codified the commitment to equal protection under the law, their historical cognitive horizon was severely limited. Many of them did not believe that commitment applied to ending racial segregation, and they certainly could not conceive of it applying to marriage equality.
But the crucial point of reflective fidelity is that the commitment to the principle of equal protection was made, and it was embedded into the transgenerational project.
Right.
Reflective fidelity requires a modern court to look at that historical commitment, strip away the specific historical prejudices of the authors, and apply the principle reasonably to the realities of today's society. Over time, honoring the trajectory of that commitment inevitably evolves to dismantle segregation and protect same-sex marriage. It is about remaining faithful to the enduring principle, not the flawed temporal application of the original authors.
But this introduces a very dangerous tension. If the court is tasked with representing the unborn and evolving these commitments over time, how do we stop the judges from simply making things up? What prevents a panel of unelected judges from saying, well, we believe the unborn future generations want us to ban all gasoline-powered vehicles immediately, and using their power to enforce that? Where is the boundary line between interpreting the Constitution and just unilaterally rewriting it?
That boundary is defined by the strict red line between interpreting and transforming. Interpretation involves identifying an existing commitment that is already explicitly or implicitly embedded in the constitutional text and finding the most reasonable application of that specific commitment for the present day.
It is tracing the line from a seed that was already planted.
Yes, exactly. Transformation, on the other hand, is the act of inventing a completely new foundational commitment out of thin air, one that has no roots in the existing constitutional project. Courts are strictly constrained to act as interpreters. They possess absolutely no legitimate authority to transform the Constitution.
So, if a society faces a crisis or a technological shift that genuinely requires a completely new foundational commitment, perhaps a fundamental new right regarding digital privacy or artificial intelligence that requires a formal democratic constitutional amendment.
Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate mechanism of democratic change. Let's say society does need to structurally evolve. Or let's say the Supreme Court gets the interpretation completely wrong and the citizens need to correct it.
The living voters do possess the amending power. They can legally alter the Constitution, but how do we evaluate if an amendment is actually legitimate? Just because a proposed amendment survives the procedural hurdles and wins a majority vote, does that automatically make it a valid exercise of constituent power?
Ferrara argues forcefully that procedural success does not equal normative legitimacy. He introduces the vital concept of implicit unamendability. This doctrine asserts that even if a nation's constitution does not feature explicit clauses stating these specific articles can never be changed, there are fundamental structural pillars of the democratic project that simply cannot be amended away by the current voters.
So even if the voters follow every legal rule, hold a legitimate election, and overwhelmingly pass an amendment, it could still be fundamentally illegitimate. What kind of amendment falls into that category?
Any amendment that destroys the basic democratic structures of the state or eliminates fundamental human rights is implicitly unamendable. For example, if a political movement rallied 90% of the electorate to pass a constitutional amendment stating, from this point forward, only citizens who own a specific amount of property or who belong to a specific ethnic group are allowed to vote, that would be an illegitimate exercise of amending power.
Even with a 90% majority, it violates the core transgenerational project. But why? If the vast majority of the living electorate demands it, and they follow the amendment process, what is the philosophical mechanism that makes it illegal?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanism is a concept called vertical reciprocity.
Vertical reciprocity. Let's break this down because this is really the key to the entire deep dive. We are very familiar with the concept of horizontal reciprocity in our daily lives. Horizontal reciprocity is the social contract of treating your neighbor as a free and equal citizen today, in the present moment.
Right.
You don't steal your neighbor's property and they don't steal yours. You respect their right to vote and they respect yours. It is a horizontal relationship across the current timeline.
Vertical reciprocity applies that exact same moral obligation, but stretches it vertically across time. If the electorate living right now is just one single temporary link in a very long multi-generational chain, then vertical reciprocity demands that you treat your great-grandparents who built the structure and your great-grandchildren who will inherit it as free and equal citizens.
You cannot use your temporary amending power to alter the constitutional essentials in a way that would make it impossible or entirely unreasonable for future generations to live under those rules. You have a binding obligation to the future to leave them a democratic structure that is intact, functioning, and capable of self-correction.
You cannot use the tools of democracy to vote an end to democracy. Doing so structurally disenfranchises the next generation, robbing them of their equal right to self-governance. And this leads us to Ferrara's ultimate test for evaluating whether a constitutional amendment is truly the enduring will of the people or simply the fleeting, panicked will of the voters.
So how do we prove it?
An amendment is only a legitimate exercise of constituent power if it meets two criteria. First, it must not contradict the core, unamendable constitutional commitments of the Republic. And second, and this is the definitive historical proof, it must not be immediately repealed by the subsequent generations that inherit it.
The perfect historical demonstration of this is the 18th Amendment in the United States, prohibition.
Yes, exactly.
The electorate of that specific era mobilized, followed the rules, and successfully passed a constitutional amendment banning the sale of alcohol. At that specific moment in time, the voters demanded it. It was codified into the highest law of the land.
But the very next generation inherited that amendment, experienced the disastrous structural realities of it, realized it was fundamentally incompatible with their broader constitutional project of liberty, and utilized their own amending power to completely repeal it with the 21st Amendment.
So history proves that prohibition was never actually the will of the people. It was just a temporary, localized mistake made by the voters of one specific era. The transgenerational people rejected it. It failed the test of sequential sovereignty.
That historical validation is the final proof that constitutional amending power is not a monologue delivered by the present generation to the future. It is a continuous, evolving dialogue across time.
We have covered a massive amount of intellectual ground today, dismantling assumptions that most of us take for granted every time we walk into a voting booth. We started with John Rawls's urgent quest for long-term stability in a hyper-pluralistic society, a society where we must learn to govern together, even when we profoundly disagree on the absolute truth of the universe.
We examined the mechanical threat of populism, regardless of whether it emerges from the political left or the right. We saw how populist movements threaten constitutional stability by loudly conflating today's temporary electorate with the eternal people, claiming an unlimited lawless power to smash the system based on a single electoral victory.
We track the philosophical evolution from Kelson's sterile legal equations to Schmitt's raw authoritarian power, finding the solution in the understanding that constitution making is always constrained by the normativity of the most reasonable. We solved Rousseau's riddle, exploring how a cultural ethnos transforms into a politically autonomous demos through a shared commitment to a constitutional framework.
And most importantly, we discovered that true democracy is not a serial free-for-all where every generation possesses the right to burn the structural house down and rebuild it from scratch. It is a sequential partnership.
It is governed by vertical reciprocity, the profound obligation to respect the architects of the past and protect the agency of the future. It is a fragile system protected by courts who must act as the institutional lawyers for the dead and the unborn, and it is carefully, cautiously amended by living citizens who must act as stewards of a trust fund, not absolute monarchs of their own timeline.
The intellectual toolkit you walk away with today fundamentally alters how you interpret political rhetoric.
Absolutely. So, what does this all mean for you? The next time you turn on the news or open a social media feed and you see a politician standing at a podium shouting, "The people demand this unprecedented action," or "I alone am the voice of the people," you now possess the structural framework to pierce through that rhetoric. You can look at the screen and ask the definitive question. Do you mean the transgenerational people who authored and refined our constitutional project over centuries of struggle? Or do you just mean the specific, temporary electorate that handed you power last week?
Recognizing that distinction is the intellectual armor that protects a liberal democracy from sliding vote by vote into tyranny. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that builds directly on the mechanics of vertical reciprocity we just explored. If vertical reciprocity dictates that we owe equal freedom and an intact democratic structure to future generations, that we must leave the House habitable for them, consider the amendments and the structural changes we are currently failing to make today.
We spend so much time debating what we are actively doing, but the framework demands we look at what we are emitting.
Precisely. Think about the cascading global environmental crises, the exhaustion of natural resources, or the rapid, completely unregulated advancement of artificial intelligence and digital surveillance.
These are forces that will fundamentally define the architecture of the House for the next century.
When the unborn generations finally arrive, when they unlock the door and take their place in the living room of this constitutional project, how will they judge our tenure? Will they look back at our current electorate and determine that we successfully acted as their constitutional trustees, protecting their foundational rights against unprecedented technological and ecological shifts? Or will they look at the state of the structure and see us as a generation that hoarded the sovereignty, ignored the rotting foundation, and left them trapped in a house that was no longer capable of sustaining freedom?
That reframes everything, because the next time you look around that inherited, sprawling, centuries-old house, you realize it isn't just a temporary shelter for today's desires, it is a transgenerational trust. And our most vital job is to make sure the roof doesn't cave in before the next generation even gets the keys.